Morning, guys, and welcome to the podcast. I've got a fantastic guest for you today, Patrick Eilers. He's going to talk to us about mental health as a journey, and he's a master's level clinician from Michigan. And I'm really happy to have him on to talk about the field of psychology and how you can help with optimal performance. And I'm really happy to have him on. Patrick, welcome.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on today. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah. Briefly introduce yourself, and I'm excited to dive into the questions.
Absolutely. My name is Patrick Eilers. I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of Michigan. I'm also a professional life coach. I've been a therapist for about 9 years now. I've worked in a variety of different settings in the field. So I started out as a general practitioner up in Saginaw, Michigan. I worked up there for about 2 years as a limited licensed psychologist. I decided to switch my license to become a professional counselor, which for the most part is a title switch mostly, but a little bit different focus when you're a professional counselor. So when I did that, I taught for a little while. I taught at Concordia University in Ann Arbor. I taught at Jackson College, intro to psychology. So I did that for a little while before getting back into the field in 2019. Worked at a startup practice in Lapeer, Michigan, which is outside of Detroit. So I was able to be there for a little while, for about a year. And then when the pandemic happened, got a chance to, the practice wasn't really being successful because of everything that had been going on in society with the pandemic and everything. So I had a chance to go work for a specialty practice in Novi, which is again is a suburb of Detroit. Worked the last 4 years as basically a specialist for sexual addiction, working in a sexual addiction recovery program, helping people overcome sexual compulsivity. And then at the end of this 2024 year, I started my own business, Bloomworks Concepts and Coaching, moved into my own space and moved more into the mental health, the wellness coaching realm, more so getting away from some of the therapy background and more into mental health coaching. That's where I'm at right now and going forward in 2025 and then forward from there, moving more to that space. It's a little bit about me and where I've gone in my career.
Yeah. And yeah, quite interesting. I love your path as a clinician. And talk to me about when people come to you for help or coaching, what are they coming to you most commonly for? What types of problems or issues?
The last 4 years, certainly my focus has been sexual addiction and sexual health. Certainly as a sex addiction specialist, you work with folks who are struggling with some type of usually porn addiction or sexual addiction of some kind. Typically are having behaviors that they can't control, that type of acting out, we call it. So basically they're engaging in some type of either an extramarital affair or some type of relationship. If they're in a relationship, it's breaking the relationship. If it's not, it's usually unhealthy porn use would be the main source of people coming in for that type of work. So a little bit different in that focus when I was there, as far as that was my main thing we worked with. So we really didn't do a whole lot beyond that. Now, again, there's a lot of things in life that are part of that. So you're working in a lot of different areas with people, but initially that's what brings them in. And then before that, typically we'd see a lot of people struggling with depression, anxiety. That was the main two, I'd say. Life struggles, grief was one we dealt with quite a bit when I was a general practitioner. So different in those areas in the past, more so bringing people in for those kind of things. But for the most part, like I said, the last 4 years, I've been focusing really on sexual addiction. So that's been what people typically come in. As a coach, I think we're going to see a mix of people. I'm still going to work with people who are struggling with sexual sobriety, but that's not going to be my main focus. It's just going to be something part of the wellness of life. I'm looking at like the 8 dimensions of wellness, which are really a circle of a variety of different things in your life, relationships, your spiritual life, your work life. There's lots of different areas that includes, and helping people based on how to find more wellness in their life so that they are able to navigate those struggles that they have that kind of everybody deals with. They're not necessarily specifically tuned to one area or another. They're just what are people wanting to improve in their life and kind of learning about themselves, learning about their identity, emotional intelligence, and kind of communication skills that's the main focus with that.
Interesting. A follow-up question I have for you is, so when we talk about mental health and society, what are some of the most significant mental health challenges facing individuals today, and how can society better support those struggling with them?
Yeah, right now it seems really coming out of the pandemic, it seems like there's been a lot of people struggling with anxiety. It's a word we use a lot. We talk a lot about that in the culture. Certainly anxiety is an area where people seem to struggle, just overall worriedness or anxiousness about kind of things that are happening in the world and the things that are changing. And there's a lot of things that are changing. Certainly can understand people's struggles with that. I think depression certainly is up there as well. Whether that's actually where that's in their career, whether that is in sort of their individual relationships, whatever that may look like. Those are usually the two big ones that we see quite often. I think the areas that I would say I see a lot just in social media, would be relationships particularly related to dating or finding somebody who's a life partner. Those are pretty big ones as far as how that's affected, and relating that to sex addiction. We see a lot of that from a perspective of how does sex addiction or pornography particularly affect people's ability to date or date in a healthy way. So that's something we see quite a bit when it comes to those areas as well. I'd say those are probably the big areas at least I've run into. I mean, I think there's other areas as well. I mean, I think there's a lot of different symptomologies that people experience out there. Certainly ASD and ADHD have been ones that have been highlighted over the last probably 20 some years. People have raised awareness to that. So there's some of those as well.
Yeah. The next question I have for you is what I found really interesting, because you talk about porn and sex addiction. And so what types of traumas, particularly emotional trauma or things that happened in the past, set someone up for these types of addictions?
There are certain people that have physical abuse story. Sometimes there's a physical abuse story to their life. So they've had something like that. I wouldn't say that's, I don't like using the word common, but I wouldn't say it's uncommon either. I'd say it depends on the person, but there are sometimes something like that that's part of their story. I think from an emotional trauma perspective, it's people who have experienced a lot of rejection in their life from other relationships, whether it be from in school, whether it be from growing up, certainly in dating. That's one that can play a role there. When you were rejected by a lot of people from a dating perspective, or maybe you didn't even feel like you could try because you didn't feel that you were worthy to date somebody. A lot of those things can definitely add up to that desire to just turn inwardly and experience pornography, and that can gives you the release, and you're not necessarily focusing on the relationship. So what ends up happening is a lot of people become very isolated. When they become more isolated, the body wants to do the same thing, brain likes to do the same thing over and over again. It likes to get in that same pathway. It's comfortable there, so to speak. So when that happens, people like to return back to that behavior, and it's very powerful. So I think a lot of times it comes back to emotional safety. Certainly when there's a lot of emotional trauma, that can be really hard to have that. Your body reacts to those things. A book that's been pretty commonly talked about in the society lately has been a book by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. And that's a book that we talk a lot about in the recovery process, is like your body holds on to some of those traumas, even if they're emotional traumas, and they can be pretty impactful for people's behaviors. So there's a lot of that can come up as far as why people can get addicted, or certainly can become compulsive with the pornography use, or their relationships that are not healthy for them.
Follow-up question I have for you is, when we're on this top trauma and set yourself up, and then you talk about the nuances of sexual addiction recovery and how it differs from other forms of addiction treatment.
Yeah, so I think the big thing with sex addiction recovery, one of the things, there are 12-step programs available out there, and that's probably the most common way people would address it. They'd either go through SA, Sexaholics Anonymous, there's SLA, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, and then there's a faith-based one called Celebrate Recovery, which people sometimes will be part of it too. So 12-step programs are really important, I think, from a perspective of the relationship healing, right? So that people are getting comfortable with our people that they recognize that they can relate to, people that they can discuss these things with. Again, when you can't talk about it, which a lot of people feel a lot of shame to talk about it, that's why they don't seek help. So certainly 12-step programs are important. But with substance use, usually, I think certainly when you're talking about drug and alcohol substances, removing the substance is part of that, is part of the treatment, right? So you're getting an opportunity to be away from that substance and then hitting the reset. Sex addiction is a little more challenging in that sense, because typically you don't go to an inpatient type of a settings. There are inpatient settings that are in the United States and around the world, but certainly there's a little limitation to those. And again, they're usually a little more money. You might do an intensive program of therapy for a month or so, month and a half, and then come back to like an outpatient type setting to work on the remaining things in your life. So that's a little bit, it's similar, but it's different, because I think the practice I was working for, they modified the inpatient program into an outpatient program. So it was a lot longer of a treatment plan, 3 to 5 years. So what would happen is people continue living their life, but they're going through this long process of going through this whole program. And sometimes for some people, that's what's needed. Some people, it's a little harder because that's not what's needed. It's too much. They're doing more than what they needed to do, kind of thing. So it just depends, I think, on the circumstances and on the clients. But I do think it's a little bit different in that sense, because it can be a lot deeper than necessarily just removing the substance, so to speak. And because sex is everywhere, especially on social media and it's a lot of different places for people, they have a lot higher chances of relapse than they do with necessarily like a substance per se.
And the next question I have for you is this, because you work with Green Cross for Traumatology, and it influenced your approach to clients who have experienced trauma. Talk about that.
Yeah, so Green Cross is an organization that goes to particularly locations around the world, mostly in the United States, I believe, but around the world where locations that have been affected by some type of natural disaster. So I haven't had an opportunity to go to any of those things yet. I haven't gone through the training completely, but I've started the training. And that's something that is an interest to me. It's a short-term trauma based type of you're present with the person who's going through. There's these floods in North Carolina, people going there and to support the people who've gone through those type of natural disasters in that sense. So that's really where that is. I do think that's something that's important. It's something in the news. We don't hear a lot about how those people have been really truly affected. You get a sense a little bit from some of the coverage, but you never really get a sense of how their life has really been impacted. So that's something I'd like to do moving forward in my career, is be able to do that. It is one of those things where you have to be more ready than you have to be prepared for when there's a time coming and be able to volunteer to do it. So there are a couple of reasons why it's been so far in my career I haven't been able to do it, but that is something I'm interested in doing for sure.
The follow-up question I have for you is, because I have a colleague and she's a psychiatrist, but then she's also branching out, much like you are doing. She's branching out into performance psychiatry, and as opposed to treating disorders, she's actually coaching and helping people achieve their full potentials. What are the difference between life coaching and therapy, and how do you decide which approach is best for a client?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So therapy really looks at, and again, I can't really speak too much to psychiatry. I know a little bit about, at least in Michigan, psychiatrists, they're usually medical doctors who want to work with mental health. Their training may be a little bit different than other parts of the other states, but from a perspective of therapy really is looking at the roadmap that got a person to where they're at. So if you think about it from, you're looking back, so to speak, in your life, and you're trying to help them untangle that roadmap of how they got to where they're at. And usually that involves some type of diagnosis. It usually involves some type of background of how they got to where they're at, and teaching them how to navigate, that part of their understanding of their life. In a lot of cases, that can be really helpful. But what I've run across, especially working with sex addiction, is that there's a lot of people who have a pretty good idea how they got where they're at. They may not necessarily always understand what was the first domino that knocked it down, but they have a pretty good idea of all the dominoes in between the first one and where they're at. And so for me, the reason I like the life coach and the wellness coaching idea is that I think it moves people much more to where they can live in their full potential, like you just talked about. So certainly the idea of looking forward in their life. So life coaching and mental wellness coaching is really about looking toward your future and casting your vision, understanding where your vision is. If you were to close your eyes and say, okay, this is where I want to be in 10 years, what would that look like? Helping that person get there. I really feel like it's a lot more relationship based. There's evidence that things like CBT and those kind of things in therapy work. And I definitely think that's been impacted in the last 25, 30 years of therapy, certainly is shown that's true. But I think moving forward, especially with younger generations, we're really looking more into how is the relationship going to impact people's long-term wellness. I think that's a big part of it. Traditional types of therapy, because there's so many other resources out there was even 10 years ago, has changed a lot of the perspective of where people can go and where they can access that assistance. So I think like you said, your colleague is looking at performance coaching and some of those kind of things. I think that gives people a much more middle ground to where they can really improve themselves, and they don't feel like they're necessarily digging into a lot of these different areas with therapy, because sometimes they may not necessarily need that. Now, your other question was, how do I determine that? I think the two things you have to look at, number one, you have to look at where's the person able to function currently, especially when people come in that I've worked with in different settings in my career. A lot of times there's things that they maybe wanting to work on that don't qualify for a certain diagnostic. This person doesn't qualify to be fully depressed. They may have one of the 5 sort of areas of depression, but they don't have all 5 of them necessarily. So they don't really necessarily need the type of depression type of treatment plan that maybe somebody else who would experience all 5 of those areas might. And so what ends up happening, I think, when you have those you're stuck in a rock and a hard place as a therapist, because you have to, for insurance purposes, you have to meet the criteria, but at the same time, you also want to try to help them get where they need to go. So there's a lot of people who I think experience that in between space they're probably not, fully diagnosable in this one area, but they are struggling with some things in life. And so you have to approach it from that perspective, I think, of where they're at with their current functioning. And then also, is this something that I can assist them in a little bit shorter term, maybe than versus therapy? Sometimes therapy can be a longer term thing, meaning it could be a year or more, depending on the person's experience. But then there's our parts of it where the wellness coaching kind of helps. Maybe it's spread out more, but you're able to do more things in the time that you do have when you're working with people. So I think those are a couple things to consider.
Yeah. And what I love is, because this podcast is all about entrepreneurship, you're transitioning, and what inspired you? Because what I've seen is I've had financial advisors and planners come on, but they're focusing on specific niche, could be de-ink or it could be just other niche things. What inspired you to start Bloomworks Concepts in coaching, and what challenges have you faced thus far as a solo practitioner?
Yeah, the main reason I wanted to start it, I think, really coming back to last year when I was still working for the previous practice I was working for, and there were a couple questions I started asking myself, and the first one was, I see myself changing in how I view therapy. We were just talking about that, why the coaching seems more impactful, and I had conversations around that with a lot of different colleagues and people of, okay, this is something I think is changing, and I want to be ahead of the curve rather than behind the curve as far as that changing the process of becoming a little more focused in that area. So that I think it also fits my skill set better. So I started moving toward that direction. I felt the main reason of starting it was if I'm going to be starting over, so to speak, which every time you make a transition in this field, you have to sit the reset again from where you're at from zero, because you're not always bringing a lot of clients with you, especially if you move from different locations. So for me, it was, do I want to start my own? Do I start my own business? I start my own practice from zero, or do I go and start somebody else's from zero, kind of things? That was the main reason. Was I decided I want to try to give this a go for myself and follow my own perspective of that. And I hadn't really planned in my career I was going to own my own practice, but it just had worked out that way. That's been the way it's fit for me. So I think those were the first main reasons. And then I think the other reason was too is that that niche we were just talking about between sort of the therapy and maybe somebody who's the worried well is what they typically call it. I think that's really where like I said, my skill set sits. And so it's going to be hard to find a practice that may say, okay, yes, we want to hire you fully to just do that. We're going to be hiring you to do some other stuff as well. And that was the thing. I felt like an opportunity for me to be able to be more specific to what I can do well and what my background is. And then also being able to do other things, not only with social media, but also as a supervisor in some other areas that I have within my training. So that was where I felt motivated to want to move in that direction.
I know we have a couple more minutes remaining, and what's interesting is I'm curious to get your thoughts on the future of mental health support, and especially what innovations or changes do you hope to see in the field of counseling and therapy over the next decade, and how are you positioning yourself to take advantage of it?
Yeah, I think I think there's going to be certain things there's always going to be a need for things like recovery programs and individual therapy and those kind of things. I think those are good things. Obviously, those are proven to work for people. But I do think there's a change that's coming that's going to be moving, especially with the onset of everybody going virtually. There's been more of a movement toward relationships and, like I said, that focus of helping people, walking alongside them. And just that, I think that shift for the population to see that therapy is not something that is necessarily a weakness or whatnot. I think that's one of the big stigmas that keeps people from wanting to. The other side of that, what I'd say with it is just the cost of it and the cost structure. Certainly there's certainly grants and stuff that people will get and will receive, but there's a lot of it's still insurance based. And so there going to be a shift I'd like to see that change a little bit, just because the insurance limits a lot of stuff that therapy can do. And that's why I think coaching's taken off, is because you're able to move to more a private pay type of scale, where people just come in and pay for the service and you can help them with what you can in that area. The other thing I think with coaching that's changing some things as well is just the ability to be able to do bigger groups, like work with bigger groups of people who do Zoom calls, and you have so many people come in and talk about whatever's going on. And they're not all the time type things. They're once a month or twice a month, something like that. So there's a little bit of different, some models that are shifting, and some of those things are changing. So I think those are some things I'm hoping I'm positioning myself for that. I certainly think YouTube and Patreon, some of those kind of areas and those outlets are definitely good things for people. And so that's some things that you give more ease of access for people to be able to be impacted. And really, ultimately, for me, I want to inspire people to move forward. That's the big thing, is that if you can help people live healthier lives, that dominoes on other lives, and then eventually that starts to change all society. That's the goal, right? Is to continue to help one life change in our life and that kind of thing. So that's hope. I'm hoping I'm getting in front of that. I don't know for sure, but it seems like I'm moving in that direction. So I'm excited about that.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts about if you think there's going to be an AI therapist, because with technology and then now with ChatGPT, it's if you think if that's like the first line entry before going to guys like you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen some things on the news and just some other areas. Yeah, the AI is they're trying to find a way to make AI be able to be empathetic. And one of the things the downside about AI is that yes, it could be empathetic, and maybe it could reflect statements and those kind of things, and that's great. But is it just going to give you what you want to hear kind of thing? That'd be my concern with that. Is it really going to help you grow and challenge you, or is it going to just look at it as going to tell you that you're wonderful and great and awesome, and that's those kind of things? So, and sometimes you need that encouraging apps that, certainly is important in that way, but I can't necessarily replace the challenging part. It can't replace the ability to be able to see different nuances with people. I think definitely help people process that way. So there may be AI therapists that just don't know how great they're going to be. Or they're going to really help people make major changes in their life. I think maybe it's a small type thing, but those are some things I guess I would think about with that.
Yeah. And how can people find out more about you and check out your work and follow you on social media?
Yep, absolutely. So I have a LinkedIn, Eilers, MALPC. Bloomworks Concepts and Coaching is the business, so we're on LinkedIn. We do have a YouTube page, Bloomworks Concepts and Coaching. It's one whole word. We're on Patreon as well, patreon.com/Bloomworks. The email is bloomworkscc@gmx.com. And you can always reach me through there as well. And then we don't have a website yet, but it will be bloomworkscc.com, I believe, is the website once we're up and running there. But everything else is, you can access me in any of those other areas.
Yeah, excellent. And thanks so much, and keep up the great work.
Thanks for having me, Chris. I appreciate it.